Okay, so to insert an invisible zip, the most important thing at the beginning is how big the opening is. And on the piece of fabric that I have here, representing the opening where the zip is going to go, the seam is closed up to here. It's very important that you don't press this open beforehand. It's a much more forgiving process if we don't press beforehand. So the next thing you need to double check is the teeth of the zip will be going down about 1.6 centimeters from the top, because our seam allowance up here is 1.5. So we want the top part of the zip, which I always call this little plastic section here, that needs to start 1.6 centimeters down. So when we sew our 1.5 seam allowance off onto our waistband or onto our facing, that we don't sew through this. So then the zip will go down, and the next most important thing is that the zip needs to open to about 2 centimeters lower than the seam is closed to. So if your seam is open the whole way to here, it's impossible to get it in. So being an invisible zip, we are aiming to sew inside the teeth in here. So when we roll the teeth back, we're aiming to sew right in here underneath the roll. So the easiest way to get that in is to press the teeth open first of all, and we're aiming to have the teeth standing upwards from the edge here, so that they're not lying flat, they're not flat in the other direction, but they're standing up at a right angle to the base of the zip. So to press the zip open, I'm just going to take the yarn, ideally without steam, because steam is going to make it too flat. So I'm just with my finger here pressing the teeth out open and going in with a reasonable amount of heat, but not steam. So the end effect now is that the teeth are folding up, but they're not folded completely flat. Now, so the hardest next step is working out which side of the zip goes into which side of the garment. So if we work on the inside of the garment, fold the seam out as it will look when it's sewn closed, because essentially the zip is going into the seam exactly where the seam would have sewn closed, just being replaced by a zip opening. So if you place the zip down right side to right side, or we're placing it down inside out as such onto the fabric, then I know I can only do one side at a time. So I'm going to pin this side here first. So I'll just put a temporary pin in here. While I'm working at the top, I need the plastic teeth section to go down 1.6. So there's 1, there's 0.6. And what is also going to happen, just move this down here for a second, is I want just inside the teeth here where I'm going to be sewing to be exactly 1.5 in from the edge here. So I'm going to put a second pin in here at 1.5. So this is 1.5 gets me to here. So what's going to happen now is I'm going to move this up, and that little plastic bit up at the top of the teeth needs to sit in where that angle is there, where the pin is.
From the 1.6, yeah?
Yeah. So I'm folding away the excess fabric, so it's that little plastic bit is going to go right there. So I'll put a pin in to hold it down. So now I can take out these pins. So the plastic bit up at the top is 1.6 down. I've measured in here 1.5, so 1.5 centimeters in is the sewing line that the zip will sew in along. So now I'm going to use the overlock as a guide. So it is just over the edge of the overlock as I go down. And down to the end here. What I'm going to do is we're aiming, if I fold away the side we're not sewing, I'm going to put a pin in here temporarily. So I have my seam sewn in black, so I'm aiming to stitch to this black thread so that it lines up with my previous seam. So I'm going to line the zip up, and I need to be really sure here where I sew it in, that where it is sewing exactly from this plastic button here, that it lines up exactly with that previous stitch. Okay, so that looks fairly accurate. So I'll pin it out at that. And then I'll realign the pinning here to match, so that this one up here is just a little bit crooked. Okay. Okay, so to sew the invisible zipper on, we are going to work with the invisible zipper foot, which for the Bernina is a number 35. So just to give you a look, the foot has 2 grooves in it designed to take the invisible zipper teeth. And when we look at that from the side, you can see that it has a groove here to take the teeth on one side and a groove on the other side to take the teeth on the other side. So just placing that back on the machine. Make sure the thread is going through the hole in the middle of that foot. Okay, because if you get thread knotted up at the very beginning, it is super annoying. So 2 threads neatly out the back of the machine. Make sure the needle is in the center. So on the Berninas, you have an option to place the needle to the side. So it is lined up with the groove in the center. So now the hardest bit when you're getting started is to get the initial roll of fabric under the correct groove on the foot. So you can sometimes worry, are you going to sew into the correct groove? So if I place it deliberately, just for a second, into the wrong one, so this one is the wrong side, then I know I'm actually going to be sewing the fabric and not the zip. So I can now, having done that little test, know that it's the other groove I'm aiming to get it into, but we're aiming to round those teeth up so that the teeth are standing at right angles, 90 degrees up and into that particular foot. Okay, so I'm just going to hold those 2 threads taut out the back, and I also would suggest that you start about 1/2 centimetre down, even slightly further down, because if you start at the very top, the foot gets confused, it doesn't know what it's sewing, and it's like it gets a fright at the very beginning. So I'm just going to sew the first stitch or 2, and I need to work quite slowly at the beginning, because sometimes the plastic teeth here, when they bump into the foot, don't go in. So, and then I'm going to go back the whole way to the beginning. Okay, so I can safely remove the first pin. And now I'm using my index finger on my left hand to hold those teeth up so that I feel under some control of where the teeth are. And I need to be careful that they really are open but up at right angles. I would say slowly does it, little by little. Double check the teeth are upright. Now, what I always do at the very, very end is, I was careful pinning, but I never trust at the very end. Am I aiming to get exactly the bottom lined up with this previous stitch that I'm aiming for, this black stitch? So I've double checked, I'm happy enough. I'm going to keep going another little bit. And now I'm aiming to sew until I hit that crease, because I have to go as far down as I possibly can. So I think I'll get 1 more stitch in. Okay, you might possibly wind the machine by hand for that last stitch or 2. Okay, and back stitch well. So I've just inserted the zip here, right down to the crease as instructed. So when I turn the fabric over, what I was aiming to do was to have, this is where the zip is sewing in here, and this is my previous seam. So ideally those 2 pieces of thread align exactly here. So again, it's a little bit like pretending it's finished. Settle the zipper down flat and always ask yourself, is that the way I want it to look when it's finished? And if the answer is yes, then we're doing it the correct way. So I always say pat it down so that the fabric looks flat and happy. Flat and happy means if it doesn't have any lumps or bumps before we get started, then we're unlikely to have lumps or bumps afterwards. So checking the side we've sewn already. Are there any lumps and bumps in here? The answer is no. Check the other side, which we haven't sewn yet. And if there are no lumps and bumps in there, which there aren't, that looks nice and flat. So before anything moves, I would always put a pin in above and below the point that we've previously sewn to. So we've previously sewn to this point, so I want to place 1 pin here above where I've sewn, on the side I've already sewn, and then I'm going to place a pin on this side directly opposite and a pin below, and this pin is the most important pin of all of those pins. So I've sewn to here, so I'm going to put 1 pin in on this side. I am going to put 1 pin in on this side. And then the one down here is the most important of all the pins. Okay, and then I can realign my zip like this, and I can pin away until I get to the top. So probably the easiest thing to do is to match the overlock on this side to the overlock on this side. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to put a pin in here. And I'll put 2 pins in here. So I've got one here and one there. Now if I was being really accurate, I'd measure in 1.5. But the overlock there being a bright colour is going to make it easy enough. So now I need to open up the zip so that I can sew that second side in. So what I'm aiming to do is open it down until I am almost at the bottom of the opening. So I'll go down a little bit further. And then I want to place the toggle through that little gap. And then on the inside here, I should be able to take the toggle down on the side here that doesn't have the zip at the bottom. Okay, so I have it there now. So when I pull that toggle down, the zip is now open a good bit below the seam I'm sewing it closed to. So I keep this pin in, although it's less important at this point, but it will give me stability when I'm sewing, and this is the one I don't take out until I'm finished. Okay, so I'm ready now to take it to the machine, and we're going to start at the top and we're going to sew down as close as we can get, but we will not be able to get to this previous stitch. I will only be able to get as far as the foot will allow me to go, so I'll only be able to get to about here, and there will be a tiny hole on this side. So for the second side of the zip, we're going to use the other side of the groove here. So we need to settle down the foot so we can see that that zip is settled nicely at right angles up into that gap. So again, I'm starting about a ½ centimetre down from the top because the machines don't like you starting at the very beginning. So I'm not going to take the pin out yet until I've made a decent start. So now I can take this first pin out. And simply following along, making sure that these teeth are at right angles. This is the most important point, is that those teeth are at right angles. Okay, and exactly on our seam allowance is where the stitching is. So our seam allowance in this case is 1.5. So we're stitching the zip along the 1.5. Now, so this is our most important pin. So I'm not quite ready to remove that one just yet. I'll just go a little bit further down. And now I need to double check that, just like the last time, that the stitch would align with our first black stitch here. So it does look, it's very close, but I have to take the pin out. And this is where this pin at the bottom is the magic pin. This holds this exactly in place so that it doesn't suddenly get loose or suddenly get tight until I have sewn it down as far as I can go. But at this point, I am going to double check that it is going to sew exactly to meet that little black stitch there. So I'm going to align it over here slightly better. And then continue sewing, but you'll note I will have to stop sewing in a second because the foot is going to bump into the other side of the zip. So at this point, people get greedy and they want to go really far. So I've now bumped into it. I now have to stop. So I would say backstitch well. Make sure you're trimming all of the loose threads as you go, because otherwise you're going to close your zip and you're going to break it before you've had a good chance to put it together. So now I can take out the 2 pins. And on the side I've sewn, again we're aiming for these 2 rows of stitching to align, and this is the gap that you can't avoid. Okay, so at this point the zip is open down to here and we're going to close it, and this is the last time that we'll be able to get the zip toggle down this far. So I need to pull the toggle up. All these fiddly toggles, there we go. So I'm going to pull it the whole way up to the top. And this is the moment of truth when we turn it over to see, did we end up with a bubble here? So it doesn't have any bubbles. Now obviously the finish doesn't look great because the zip is the wrong colour. I deliberately chose a contrast colour for you to see. So at this point we could press out the seam here, but I would normally press it at the very, very end when I have done the final sewing. So what I would normally do is, with the invisible zips, they need just a little bit more stability on the inside so that they zip up and down without any difficulty. So with the zip closed, what I am proposing to do is to stitch the zip to the seam allowance, but I want to secure it right down to the very bottom of the zip. So I'm lining up the teeth here, so this flappy bit that's left, and this will seal the little hole that got left on the other side. So pinning the zip down the whole way, making sure it's aligned with the crease in the center. So I'm going to take just the zip and the seam allowance, and I'm going to use a number 4 foot to attach it down to the bottom. So I'm just going to change the number 35 foot. I'm going to replace it with a number 4 foot. So if you're working with a Bernina machine, beware, because the needle is now perfectly in line with the foot and you can break the needle very easily. So we're going to use the knob on the right of the machine to move the needle to the right or the left. So I'm going to move the needle to the left, place the thread under the foot, and be aware with this particular foot it is only connecting with these dog teeth at the back. It won't make any contact with these teeth here, so to sew accurately it'll need a little bit of help and encouragement to go through as I sew. So I'm just going to start up at the top of the zip here. Again, start a little bit further in so the fabric is over these dog teeth at the back. So I'm going to sew forwards a little bit and then backwards a little bit. I don't have to go right up to the top because that will be in the seam allowance when I'm done. So it's not important where I sew, but I don't want to sew too close to the teeth, and there's no need to sew too close to the edge. And once I get to the bottom of the zip, just make sure that the seam allowance is nice and flat, and I'm going to sew the whole way down to the end. Okay, and I'm going to do the same on the other side. So thread under the foot, taking out the pin here, and I'll sew the same distance up on this side.